I personally cannot live comfortably in the midst of abject poverty and hunger and human misery. If I have the possibilities of, even in a modest way, with the help of my many scientific colleagues, of doing something about improving the lot of these many young children for their generation. This is a new experience for me here south of the Sahara, but I see the same fire now beginning to burn. I call this setting the grassroots on fire, and it's heating up for the political decision makers. And God willing, and also the will of the political leaders, the opportunities exist here for a major breakthrough in production that can become a model for African countries south of the Sahara. I dislike seeing miserable people, and whether it's from hunger and starvation or just the plain brutality of poverty itself or sickness, it's all part of the same package.
For more than 50 years, Dr. Norman Borlaug has battled against hunger and poverty in developing countries. As the driving force behind the extraordinary change in agriculture, known as the Green Revolution, which swept through India and Pakistan in the 1960s, he became both celebrated and controversial.
I grew up on the land, on a small farm in northeast Iowa. Life was not always easy. I experienced the economic depressions of the 1930s. And from this experience, I felt that families on the land needed help from scientists, and I dedicated my life to science, and especially to food production.
I call upon you, Norman Ernest Borlaug, to come to the rostrum and receive the diploma and the gold medal of the Nobel Peace Prize for 1970.
Obviously, I am personally honored beyond all dreams by this election, but the obligations imposed by the honors are far greater than the honor itself, both as concerns me personally and also the army of hunger fighters in which I volunteered. I was born in a small rural community about 5 miles from a local village that still carried the name of Sauda, which was the name of an old Norwegian village from which my great-grandparents and grandparents came.
By the 1930s, the full force of the economic depression hit farming communities in the USA. Many of his family's neighbors went broke and were forced off the land, just as he was going to the University of Minnesota to study forestry.
In my family, I was the first to attend a university, and this was one of the things that my grandfather insisted on. He had a very strong influence on me in many ways, sort of in some ways a nonconformist. He used to say, Norman, an education, no matter how these disasters come and go, you're prepared to cope with change. It was during the depths of the Depression, many unemployed, hungry people asking for a handout for nickels. And I'd never seen this in the rural communities where I'd grown up. But this was a horrifying experience for me. That was part of me. I saw it. I am acutely conscious of the fact that I am but one member of that vast army of hunger fighters
And so I want to share not only the present honors, but also the future obligations with all my companions in arms. For the Green Revolution has not yet been won.
They were prophetic words. Less than a decade and a half later came the dreadful Ethiopian famine, which killed 1 million people and shocked the world. Food aid poured in, but it treated the symptoms, not the causes. Borlaug, by this time 70 years old and twice retired, would be drawn into the fight against hunger in Africa. It was Ryoichi Sasakawa, head of a large Japanese foundation, who would inspire and back Borlaug's move into Africa.
And he wants to know why something isn't being done about it, like was done in Pakistan and in India in the middle 1960s, when everyone said India and Pakistan are hopeless causes. And you and your group of scientists moved in and changed this situation dramatically.
Sasakawa also approached President Jimmy Carter to add his political weight to the campaign, a move welcomed by Dr. Borlaug, and they all readily agreed to a joint initiative.
Our organization has nothing to do with any governments. It's a private group of people. Our hope is to alleviate the starvation in Africa.
The Carter Center's Global 2000 program had been set up to combat health and nutrition problems in developing countries. The Sasakawa Africa Association, with Borlaug as its president, was formed to tackle the food crisis in Africa. Their joint initiative was called the Sasakawa Global 2000 Program, or SG 2000. The first country that SG 2000 went to was Ghana, not Ethiopia because of Cold War politics. In 1986, President Jerry Rawlings invited them to explore the possibility of creating a green revolution. Sub-Saharan Africa was a new experience for Borlaug, but the problems of small-scale farmers were all too familiar. What Borlaug and his SG 2000 team brought was the promise of change. Without access to technology, traditional agriculture means long, back-breaking hours in the fields with pitifully small returns. Borlaug's experience in transforming this kind of agriculture went back more than 4 decades to Mexico. In 1940, the Mexican government had requested help from the United States to solve their desperate food shortages.
I saw poverty, especially in rural areas, lack of schools, lack of sanitation, lack of water that was safe to drink, unavailability of foods, especially for children.
The Rockefeller Foundation stepped in with financial assistance for a new project to alleviate poverty.
It was far-sighted. Nothing like this had ever been done to help agriculture of a developing nation.
After studying forestry and plant pathology at university, Borlaug had worked at DuPont before being recruited for Mexico in 1944.
I thought I'd made the dreadful mistake when I resigned from DuPont, when I saw the situation. It was still tail end of World War II. You couldn't buy any equipment. We had no microscopes. We had no tractors, and there were no trained people. These were some of the oldest cultivated soils in the Americas. They had, some of them, been cultivated a long time before the Spaniards came. Nobody knows how long. And the fertility levels on some of these where I first worked were at miserably low level.
Inauspicious beginnings, but Mexico was to become the proving ground for all the techniques which would create the Green Revolution, such as fertilizer for the worn-out soils and improved seeds to raise yields. Borlaug was to become a national institution, particularly in the Yaqui Valley, where he developed so many of his ideas.
Usually you can find here Dr. Borlaug here at 5, 6 o'clock in the morning, and he left until there's no light. I believe that he's the soul of the Yaqui Valley. Really, the best thing that happened to this valley is that this coming of Dr. Borlog.
17 years later, Dr. Eugenio Martinez was to become the first country director in Ghana for the Sasakawa Global 2000 program.
Our philosophy was to try to improve whatever the farmers have. So we dedicate most of the effort initially to work together with the farmers, to show them and find out how much was possible to increase the production, the productivity of their farms.
What they brought to the farmers was a package of fertilizer, improved seed, and better crop management.
There's just a lot of fallacy about the ultra-conservative, the resistance of change of the traditional farmer. You show him how he, through the adoption of a new technology, can increase his yield or productivity, and he's ready to change.
The new methods were introduced to Azuma Kunda by government extension worker Osman Abdullahi. Mobilizing national extension services to take technology to farmers is a key strategy for Borlaug. Azuma farms maize in Ghana, and she was using the technology for the first time. She had grown half her plot using traditional methods, and the other half as a production test plot, or PTP, using the new methods. The life and death difference which technology makes is astonishing. For Azuma, it means at least 3 times the yield and food security for her family. It's the result of robust, high-yielding seed varieties and restoration of soil fertility using chemical fertilizer. The basic process is technology transfer, technology based on the science of agriculture, whose origins lie in Europe during the last century. This is the Broadbalk, the most famous field in all of agricultural science. Here at Rothamsted in England, agricultural science began when in the 1840s an aristocrat, John Laws, and a chemist, Henry Gilbert, set out to discover what makes soils fertile. The experiment started here in 1843, laid the foundation for the science of soil fertility, and have been continued uninterrupted since then.
I was fascinated because from the time I was an early university student, I knew about the Rothamsted long-time soil studies, fertility studies. And it wasn't until now I had a chance to actually visit and see the things I'd read about and heard about. Fantastic. I felt like time was being telescoped. Here I am touching these things, looking at those plots, walking on those plots.
Laws and Gilbert divided the Broadbalk into strips to scientifically test different organic and chemical fertilizers, as well as all the other complex factors that affect plant growth. Every year since 1843, the wheat has been harvested and samples taken for analysis of such things as the effect of different fertilizers on yield. Deposited in this archive over 150 years, they are an extraordinary treasure trove of information. There are now more than 250,000 samples.
We have samples of soil and grain and straw samples from the long-term experiments. So, for instance, we would have unground samples of grain from the Broadbalk experiment. This one is from 1920.
Fantastic, all sorts of new insights into important issues. And to see and to touch and to feel gives it another dimension. Thank God that there were people that had vision for the future, starting with Laws and Gilbert, and many who have followed in their footsteps and made this a truly great international organization.
Rothamsted established that soil fertility can be restored and maintained with chemical fertilizers, not just in the short term, but continuously over many decades. It was critical knowledge for the future of agriculture. The Greuble family live in Benin, in West Africa. Their lives depend on the fertility of the soil. With 3 adults and 7 children to feed, on half a hectare of land, they live on the edge of survival.
In a bad year, this family will, without any doubt, starve. Left alone, they cannot make it. This is not an exceptional family. In sub-Saharan Africa, more than 60% live below the level of poverty.
I don't know if the word catastrophe really describes it properly. The future of African children is really bleak. Now, I imagine a pregnant woman, chronically hungry, therefore the baby growing up chronically hungry, being born and never being able to have a full meal.
The African population for the last 3 decades has been growing at more than 3% on the average. Food production has been growing at 2%. So we are losing ground per capita every year. And for that reason, I think it's very urgent that Africa gives #1 priority to developing its agriculture to approach self-sufficiency in the basic cereal.
The traditional agriculture is based on slash and burn. That means the farmer has to cut down the vegetation, burn the vegetation, and then plant its seed. Traditional shifting cultivation was a stable system from an ecological point of view when the population pressure was low. Today, of course, farmers are forced to stay on the same piece of land, and so we have what we call continuous cultivation.
The Greuble family has no choice but to try and survive on the same half-hectare plot, each year taking more nutrients from the soil.
People historically have settled on fertile soils where there's enough rainfall to do good crop production. What is outstanding now, what it's amazing now, it's to see these very fertile soils producing so little. The reason why, it's massive nutrient depletion. The nutrients have been taken out mainly as crop harvests and not returned enough via crop residue returns or manures or fertilizers, and therefore the soil has been gradually depleted of nutrients. So what was once very fertile, excellent soils is now just totally infertile soil.
Population pressure means that farmers are increasingly forced onto marginal lands like hillsides, stripping the vegetation and leaving the soil heavily degraded. In the rainy season, torrential rain robs the bare topsoil of its precious nutrients. This extraordinary gully in Tanzania, created in only 4 years, represents a catastrophic loss of soil fertility, a chilling echo of the soil erosion in the United States during Borlaug's youth in the 1930s.
As population goes up and at the same time nutrient depletion continues unabated, land degradation becomes a real nightmare. And it gets to the point that people are leaving the land, that people are fighting for each other's neighbors' land. And let me say that a lot of the catastrophes in Rwanda and Burundi have this nutrient depletion, fertility depletion as one of the underlying causes of it.
Agriculture has to hold the line to produce the food that is needed for a rapidly growing world population. But at the same time, that line cannot be held indefinitely. It's a question of holding the line while the world population is being educated to the fact that there's a certain carrying capacity of this planet Earth, utilizing its land and water resources.
The Green Revolution had two critical components: restoration of soil fertility and improved crop varieties. When Borlaug initiated Mexico's wheat program in 1944, stem rust, a fungal disease, was decimating wheat crops throughout the world. So his first priority was to breed rust-resistant strains. New varieties are made by repeatedly making crosses between promising strains and selecting the best offspring.
The key to the breeding program, at that time, very few crosses were being made in all of the conventional program. And we made hundreds and soon thousands each year. And that meant that you had a tremendous genetic soup of many combinations. And we selected and discarded ruthlessly the bad ones, kept only the best.
The textbooks said that you must breed different varieties for each distinct environmental niche. But Borlaug threw away the textbook.
We used shortcuts in our breeding procedures. We found different techniques, what we call shuttle breeding, growing in 2 different latitudes, different plantings. So we speeded up everything at twice the normal, and this was part of the success. But by moving these from one environment to the other, suddenly we found that we had some varieties that would fit everywhere in Mexico, completely against the conventional wisdom. So that was part of becoming a rebel right there. And that became a part of my philosophy. Status quo is disastrous for stagnant agriculture and low productivity. You've got to find a way to break out of that vicious cycle of hunger and starvation.
Borlaug's team halved the normal development time to commercial release.
And there was a need for this urgency. The first year when they became commercial, there was a big epidemic locally of stem rust, and the old varieties were badly damaged, sometimes killed.
The new varieties were completely resistant to stem rust, a resistance that has survived throughout the world for more than 40 years.
Bring over one of those tall ones.
The Borlaug team then turned their attention to yield, crucial for increasing food production. The yield of the new varieties was limited because they grew tall and so tended to fall over when fertilized. By crossbreeding them with a dwarf variety from Japan, they got a double benefit. First, the wheats didn't fall over, and second, more of the soil nutrients went into grain rather than straw. The resulting high-yielding varieties may have been short, but they were supermen amongst wheats. By 1963, total production had increased 6-fold, and 95% of Mexico was planted to Borlaug's wheats.
These spread very rapidly, like fire, because of their superiority. We called it the quiet wheat revolution. Quiet.
The wheat revolution brought with it many changes.
The driving force behind India and Pakistan's revolution in agriculture was the terrible famine of the 1960s, when more than 3 million died. To meet the crisis, India had asked for 10 million tons of wheat, mostly as food aid, from the United States.
The U.S. was involved in the Vietnam War, and Mrs. Gandhi was bitterly opposed to this.
U.S. President Lyndon Johnson deeply resented India's opposition to the war, so he kept food aid on a short leash.
Lyndon Johnson would release small amounts so that they didn't reach starvation level, but the uncertainties were there. He kept the pressures on.
Many of Mrs. Gandhi's senior scientists were skeptical of Borlaug's work, warning that there was insufficient published data.
Many said that we were reckless, playing with the lives of millions of innocent people. That wasn't true.
But Mrs. Gandhi wanted to be free of U.S. blackmail on food aid. So she overruled her scientists and embraced his methods.
Politics get into all of these things on food production. They're nasty.
India and Pakistan both committed to Borlaug's approach, and the results, in places like the Punjab, were dramatic.
There was this huge harvest, mountains of grain by the railroad sidings waiting to be shipped, unthrashed grain on the threshing floors, and finally it was so bad they had to close the schools and store the grain. You could feel this enthusiasm, this grassroots. You stopped at farmers' field days, you stopped at experiment stations, and at the agricultural university, it was everywhere. This tremendous enthusiasm that you couldn't stop at now or you'd have trouble at the grassroots. They knew what could happen.
We have borrowed so much that for every 100 pounds we earn by selling our cocoa and other exports, we use a sizable percentage to pay for some of our debts.
Faced with a debt crisis, a food crisis, and a population crisis like much of Africa, Jerry Rawlings had welcomed the Sasakawa Global 2000 program to Ghana in 1986. Farmers took up the technology with enthusiasm, and the project expanded rapidly.
From a test or experiment we've carried out as farmers, we realized that the traditional method really does not give a very good result as against the Global 2000. This is why I want to impress upon you to go by the Global 2000 method.
Ghana had paved the way, and expansion into the rest of sub-Saharan Africa was the overall plan. By 1999, 15 countries have participated in the program. Progress has been mixed. There have been notable successes, but some political leaders have not taken the tough decisions needed to kickstart a green revolution.
This is starvation yield, and that's what we've got too much of in the world.
Well,
despite problems, by 1995, Tanzania was one country that was making progress. Dr. Abu Michael Foster was then director for SG 2000 in Tanzania.
Many of the farmers have shown a great deal of keenness to increase their productivity and therefore their income.
When Barnabas and Lavina Burra first farmed this land 20 years ago, they lived with constant food insecurity. The critical change came for them when they started to adopt more intensive cultivation. With modern maize varieties adapted to local conditions and chemical fertilizer to supplement organic sources, their yields have tripled. Their increased productivity has transformed their lives. They have built a grain store, so they don't have to sell their grain immediately after harvest when prices are low. They can now send their children to school, giving them much wider options for the future. More income has meant more and better food, with all the resulting health benefits. They're a model for neighboring farmers to learn from.
I get an inspiration when I come to this farm because I see someone who is applying all the knowledge that he has at his disposal in a wide range of farm activities. In the long term, we see farmers such as Barnabas Burra as the future of African agriculture because they represent a transition from small-scale to emergent commercial-scale farmers who are going to underpin the level of production which will meet the food demands of the future.
The Burra family is a powerful example of what the program would like to see all over sub-Saharan Africa. It is a formidable task, since population will increase by 500 million in the next 20 years. And this population pressure is already causing disturbing levels of malnutrition, as Borlaug found when he was taken on a visit to a village in Ghana in 1993 by the head of nutrition for the Ashanti region, Abena Akomo-Boateng.
Namibachire, when we went there, was just like any other Ghanaian village. Mothers who didn't look too healthy, and looking at children, you could just see the clinical signs of malnutrition. And right there and then, you know, we had this child who was showing the gross signs of kwashiorkor, puffy face, red hair, swollen limbs. It's a year old, and you see how all the hair has gone. Okay, the edema has gone down, because the last time when we were here, you know, the feet were all so swollen. But now this child is cold. The child is hospital. The child is cold. This child just died in our hands.
The child was gone. It's hard for a person from Western countries to understand this. They have to see it. How would you feel if it were your child? I know how I would feel if it were my child. I never saw this happening on the little farm where I grew up, but it happens frequently here, and not just in Ghana. Ghana, I think, is much better off than many of these countries.
3 years later, Dr. Borlaug returns to Ghana to see progress on an emerging technology designed to improve the quality as well as the quantity of food, particularly for children. With him, a world-renowned expert on public health, Dr. William Feigy. He was a leader in the eradication of smallpox and now heads a major task force for child survival.
Well, malnutrition is one of the largest problems that we have in the world. UNICEF and some other organizations estimate that we're losing 12 million children a year, maybe 1 million a month, due to malnutrition and childhood diseases. It's this combination of things, but malnutrition is the substrate.
The idea of the technology is to build better nutrition directly into cereals. Maize, the most widely grown of all cereal crops, is the first to be enhanced in this way, and the result is called quality protein maize, or QPM. Babies in this village generally look healthy. Their diet of breast milk contains all the nutrients they need to thrive. The danger time for them is after they are weaned onto maize, because maize is seriously deficient in 2 essential amino acids needed by the body to build proteins. Abena brought Borlaug and Feigy to see the problem of malnutrition in a village not using QPM.
This child is just about 2 years old, and that is the mother who is very, very pregnant, maybe delivering any time from now. Now, this child, I must say, doesn't look too healthy. I mean, you just look at the hair. She has quite a big belly for her size. And such children have changes within the liver. In addition to that, they have a lot of worms.
I was surprised to find as much malnutrition as one could see obviously in children. And I realized that this is just before the harvest season, and so we're seeing the seasonal famine. Nonetheless, you come away discouraged by the amount of malnutrition because you know these children don't have another chance.
QPM was developed after a chance discovery at Purdue University in the USA of a type of maize, of poor quality in many ways, but containing a crucial gene called OPAQ2, which doubled the levels of the missing amino acids in normal maize. Borlaug was a major force in the establishment of the Maize and Wheat Research Center in Mexico known as CIMMYT. CIMMYT's commitment is to do research which benefits small-scale farmers in developing countries, and they had taken up OPAQ2 with enthusiasm. After nearly 2 decades of painstaking work, they had bred high-yielding QPM varieties with protein quality almost as good as skimmed milk.
Wow. It was very clear that a tremendous improvement had occurred over that space of time. And indeed, the materials looked very, very competitive with our best normal materials.
But this one, on the other hand, that is beautiful.
Dr. Wayne Haig, a former CIMMYT maize breeder, has given wholehearted backing to the campaign to get QPM into Ghana. Responsible for adapting the CIMMYT varieties to the local environment is Dr. Chumasi Afriye.
Ghana is a place where QPM would just fit in. is a major staple in Ghana. Mothers use maize as the first weaning food. So when I looked around, I saw this is some new technology that would just fit in for my country.
This is a gut-fighting team of scientists that want to see this happen, that are determined to make it happen.
In Nyamibyechere, where the child had died, today the picture is very different.
Going back there, we saw that there has been a lot of changes. You could see that the children looked very, very healthy. We could see signs of development. They now had a nursery school, which wasn't there when we went 3 years ago, offshoots of the program.
We need a little extra support. And with the success that's coming now, I'm hopeful that this is forthcoming soon. It better be soon. I don't know how many years I got left here.
Fertilizer is the fuel for a green revolution. So for Africa, it is a central issue, where the main problems are cost and supply. But for the developed world, fertilizer has become the focus of an intense and frequently muddled environmental debate. And this has often seriously distorted international policy towards developing countries. Rothamsted Manor, England, where Sir John Laws conceived the classic experiments on soil fertility.
Time for lunch now, I think.
Oh,
We'll have lunch in the same place that John Bennett Laws used to eat his lunch.
Off we go then. Thank you.
Borlaug met some of the younger scientists who had a brief to challenge him on the environmental impacts of the Green Revolution.
I think this young lady wants to attack me, so now you attack me about the environmentalists. And I'm not advocating reckless use of pesticides.
What are the side effects of the Green Revolution as we have seen it in Western societies and in Asia?
First, stomachs that have got food in them. That's one very positive side effect. Now, you want the negative.
You say that we should put high-yield agriculture to Africa at the moment without taking consideration. I mean, we can go out spraying with pesticides and that will affect the environment. Fertilizers, there are many publications about the side effects of nutrients in the environment.
You've got to separate toxic substance from nutrients. Separate fertilizer from pesticides first, and then we talk about each pesticide.
I was trained that pesticides were bad, the fertilizers were bad, that we tried to utilize the natural resources to control the pest problems.
Have you ever lived on a small farm, 1 hectare? Have you ever done this production? Yes, answer me.
No.
That has a lot to do with the way you interpret these things.
And probably I'll chip in by saying, if you go to a place where there's no choice between, all you've got is food that has been produced using fertilizer, then you're going to eat it or you die.
That's the point. You're very correct. Without fertilizers, there's no chance.
When people ask whether all you're interested in is using chemical, let me tell you what the plant root says. The plant root says, I don't give a hoot whether this nitrate ion, which I'm going to eat, comes from a fertilizer bag or from the decomposition of organic matter. It doesn't make any difference to the plant. The plant doesn't care.
So do fertilizers damage the environment?
We have to admit that there's some truth to that. And the truth is in the pollution of rivers and drinking water and so on, caused by excessive fertilizer applications in the temperate world.
In the temperate world, such as Europe, more than 200 kilograms of fertilizer nutrients per hectare is average. In Africa, it's only about 10 kilograms.
This situation of excessive nutrient loading in the temperate world contrasts totally with nutrient depletion, which we have in Africa. It's just the opposite. And I would say, on the contrary, that improved, more productive agriculture in Africa will work very much towards environmental conservation. If you can produce much more in a hectare of fertile, productive soil, there is less need to go and clear additional land, which is very marginal. That is certainly the case, and that has helped tremendously in Asia.
Today we have many critics of science and technology. Many of these people would have us go back before there was any mineral fertilizer, to do it in the good old way. But will you please tell me what we would do with the additional 3 billion people that we have today that we didn't have then? Lots of times I had to bite my tongue to control my temper when bad decisions were being made for a continuation of status quo, when people were starving, when the technology we had demonstrated needed to be applied.
People are talking about a great political failure in Africa. It's not the international community to solve the problem. It's Africans themselves who must solve their own problem. But we can have some help from the international community, and we need the international community to work together. But the final issue, the final move belong, I believe, to Africans themselves.
Grassroots action is fundamental to Borlaug's philosophy of change. The village of Bowimi in Benin, the Ministry of Rural Development and Sasakawa Global 2000 have stimulated a dynamic process of change here, the sort of development which needs to happen all over Africa. The critical change has been for the farmers to pool their resources in a collective savings and loans organization.
One of the pillars of our activities is collective action. And small-scale farmers, taken alone, they can be weak, but as a group, they become a real driving force.
You have to speak in one voice. Speak as an individual. No one will hear you in government circles. But if you organize, not only in this village, but in all of these other villages, those voices start moving upward. In quite a policymaker's office, you speak brutally, frankly, saying, look, things are seething down there. If you want political stability, the games you played by in the past won't serve. You're going to have trouble. You say that thing at the wrong time, you'll be invited to leave the country.
Knowing how to play the political game has been a crucial part of Borlaug's success. In Frederick Samaye, Prime Minister of Tanzania, he found a receptive ear.
To improve the quality in the rural areas, we must improve the farmers and the farming conditions so that you have more production. But otherwise, if we don't tackle this problem, we are lost.
What we have had the privilege of seeing, and in a small, modest way participating with in your extension service on the basic food crops the last 8 years, indicates that you can double, triple, and quadruple the yield. So the potential is there, but you can't eat potential. No. You've got to have reality, grain and food to eat, to relieve human misery. Otherwise, we will have worse and worse chaos. Africa became entangled indirectly in the Cold War. Fortunately, the Cold War has terminated, but many of the ill effects of that Cold War still persist. In that period, there was too much military aid instead of food and agriculture and public health and education.
Ethiopia in particular was torn apart by the Cold War. By the time the Great Famine hit in 1984, Ethiopia was in the grip of a Soviet-backed military dictator, Mengistu Haile Mariam. The famine wasn't just caused by drought. Mengistu had used food as a weapon in a bitter civil war by denying relief supplies to the guerrilla-held areas where the famine had hit hardest. Meles Zenawi, then leader of the guerrilla forces, now Prime Minister of Ethiopia, remembers this bitter history.
In 84-85, what we faced, a sort of combination of drought and political callousness, was a threat of genocide, a very real possibility of a whole people ceasing to exist.
Another 7 bloody years of civil war. Then the end of the Cold War meant the collapse of Soviet support and victory in 1992 for Meles' guerrilla army. Could Ethiopia at last seize the opportunity to transform its agriculture? The new Meles government faced a daunting task: a wrecked economy, population rising at a catastrophic rate, and years of neglect. Near Shashamene, in the southern highlands of Ethiopia, Meles visits a group of hopeful but skeptical farmers. 85% of the population live in the rural areas, and they are beginning to find a voice, and they are demanding change. Meles needed the right prescription for change, and he had invited SG 2000 to demonstrate the Borlaug approach with farm families. Senait watches as her mother Yetnebersh prepares injera for the family. What future will there be for Senait in the new Ethiopia? Senait's father, Zagaye, together with family and neighbors, prepare to go to harvest. In 1993, the SG 2000 team set to work with just a few farm families like this. But would the government take up this revolution for the whole of Ethiopia?
Hello, Mr. President.
How are you this
Good
morning?
to see you.
Good to see you. How are you? Well, I'm fine when I'm with you, always.
1997. Prime Minister Meles welcomes Jimmy Carter and his wife Rosalind. Together with leading experts in agriculture, they are on a tour of the Shashamene area to see what's actually happening on the ground.
President Carter was unique in the sense that he was prepared to listen to what we are trying to say, as well as talk. And that was very important in encouraging me to treat him as a friend, a very real friend.
Meles had to choose between many competing models for agricultural development. Dr. Marco Quinones, SG 2000 country director for Ethiopia, had set out to persuade him to the Borlaug approach.
I was at the day before, never here.
In 1994, Meles and Carter had gone with Dr. Quinones to see some of the SG 2000 test plots.
When we came here after the program did start, it was highly successful, and he was overwhelmed with interest.
They had gone incognito in casual clothes and were not recognized. The farmers spoke frankly about past government failures, but enthusiastically about the new technology.
When the Prime Minister finally saw those plots himself,
and it was explained what this implied. He asked how long it would take. When Dr. Quinones, our country representative, told Prime Minister Meles that it would take 5 years, he said, that's too long. I want you to do this in 2 or 3 years. And this has become reality.
Their package was increasing productivity on peasant farmers' plots by a factor of 2 or 3, 200%, 300%. I saw it. So it was clearly working in terms of increasing productivity. This is a package that succeeded utilizing the resources of the peasant himself and our own extension workers. So it was very clear that it was successful and replicable. Therefore, we adopted it.
Meles welcomes Yohei Sasakawa, president of the Nippon Foundation, which funds SG 2000. Yohei Sasakawa has enthusiastically continued the commitment to Africa that his late father made after the Ethiopian famine.
非常にその非官僚的なシステムでございまして、大胆に柔軟に、そして前例にとらわれずにですね。
Their approach is unique and very much to our liking. Unique in the sense that they do not come up with a completely worked out set of formulas that will save the world. They come up with an open mind and work out solutions as they go along.
Teka Alemu joined the program this year. It's his test plot they've come to see. SG 2000 had started with just a few test plots in 1993. After Meles decided to adopt their approach, the government set up their own program, and the rate of expansion was unprecedented. 32,000 test plots in 95, 350,000 in 96, and in 97?
The package has become, it's becoming more or less universal now.
How many farmers do you think are in it now?
About 600,000 are directly involved.
600,000, yeah. And what's your ultimate goal?
Make it universal.
How many would that be?
About 9 million families.
9 million!
With the help of good weather, cereal production in Ethiopia is estimated to have doubled from 1993 to 96. And by 99, there were 4 million farmers in the government scheme. Zagaya's family and neighbors leave for the maize harvest.
Ethiopia 3 years ago was said to be the basket case of the 90s in Africa, and it's made the corner, despite all of its difficulty.
በጠቅላላ ነው የምትመልሱልኝ ማለት ነው። 5 ሲደመር 3 ስንት ነው? 8 ሰናይ 3 ከስንት ጋር ቢደመር ነው 4 የሚሰጠን? 4
The population bomb has gone off. The first 2 decades of the new millennium will be the toughest in history for feeding Africa.
If we fail and we are unable to produce food within the sub-Saharan African countries, then there would be a massive starvation in many of these countries.
I hate to hear people say Africa is too poor. They can't make these investments. How the devil then, during the Cold War, were these investments made in armaments? And it's not the fault of the African countries alone, the East and the West. And so let's clear that from the slate, and let's start over.
Norman Borlaug and his fellow hunger fighters are credited with saving 1 billion lives.
I like to play the game hard. To me, the most important game of all is the game of life. To try to elevate the standard of living of the people whom you're trying to help. And I think it requires one's best effort. I think we might be surprised what will happen in the next 8 years. I'm not sure I'll be here to see that, but I hope so. I want to see it happen in African countries.